All right, good afternoon, morning, evening, whatever time it is, wherever you are. This is my third time recording the start of this lecture, so I think it'll go correctly this time. One nice thing about teaching online, I suppose. So, hopefully you've had some time to go over the syllabus. I'll be sending out some emails about Packback and some other things later today. But as I said, we're going to start off by discussing some of the stuff that's in Chapter 1, but we're also going to talk about broader moral philosophies, sort of the underlying issues that we have to really think about as we look at different social problems. And we kind of start out by looking at theories. So theories are ways in which we try to understand the world. They're generally sets of assumptions or propositions that have at least some evidence behind them. And then you can test theories to a greater extent. You kind of build theories by hypothesis testing, and then you sort of retest it again in sort of interesting ways. So what's interesting about theory is that it's theoretical. There's no necessarily true theories in the social sciences, or at least it's very hard to find examples of this. And we'll get into that in greater detail. And especially when we talk about these things today, moral philosophy, sort of trying to figure out what's right and wrong and how we even think about things like that. Some of you have probably done this in a high school, maybe philosophy class or something, or have heard about it before. So this is the famous trolley problem. This is maybe something you could think about writing for in your discussions. So the famous trolley problem comes out of moral philosophy. And the idea here is the basic idea to kind of tests, makes you think about how you assign worth and value to people in various situations. So in the sort of classical interpretation of it, there are these two tracks here. There's this trolley that's running sort of out of control down the tracks, and it turns out there's this lever there that you see there. And you can walk up to it and change the track that the train is on. Right now, the train is coming down this track, and it's going to run over these 5 people that are tied to it. So you can pull the lever and change the tracks, and it will now go on this track and just kill this one person. So the question that I ask usually at this point, and that I'll bring up in our next Zoom session on Wednesday, which one would you choose? Would you choose to pull the lever and save the many, or would you not do anything at all and just let the train run its course and hit the 5 people? If you pull the lever, you will kill one person and not the 5 people. Now, when this question is usually asked, you have like 80-90% of people saying that they would pull the lever, that they would change the course that the train is coming down. And the reason being that, 5 lives have just numerically, quantitatively, have more worth than one person's life. Okay, so as I said, this is the question. You may want to think about it, think about how you rationalize it, and so on. And we'll maybe get into it on Wednesday. Now, there's been various different revisions of the trolley experiment. One of the first sort of variations on the trolley experiment was this one here, where you see where you're this person right here. There's a train running down the track. It's going to hit and kill these 5 people. And say that pushing this large man over the bridge so that he falls onto the tracks is going to derail the train, but it will kill him and save the 5. How many people would do that? Now, I can't see what you would do right now, but what generally happens, not generally, always happens, is that you see a disconnect between people in this situation who would pull the lever. You see a greater number of people who would be willing to pull the lever to save the 5 people by killing the one person. in this situation, you have the same sort of outcome. If you push the person over, one person dies and 5 are saved. The exact same outcome as we saw before. But for interesting reasons, people are far less likely to do this. So you see a huge drop by 30-40% in terms of willingness to push this person over. And when people are asked to rationalize it, they say, well, it's something about pushing the person. You're actually putting yourself in the situation. Well, you can argue that by deciding whether or not to pull the lever, you're putting yourself in the situation too. So there's no right answer to this question. But it does make us think about individual rights, individual liberties, and social responsibilities, broader rights that the society has, and how we balance those two things. And really, no matter what we think of the different social problems and how we address them, that's usually a balancing act. Trying to balance social cohesion, solidarity, stuff like that, and individual rights, freedoms of speech, things like this, for example. So, if you're choosing sort of the greater good over the individual, you're choosing utilitarianism. Now, I do want to point out, okay, so first of all, utilitarianism as a philosophy was sort of sketched out by this guy, Jeremy Bentham, who we believe had Asperger's syndrome, just based upon the descriptions of him, his writings, and so on. He developed this theory of utilitarianism, where he says the greatest happiness of the greatest number is the foundation of morals and legislation. So this is a very powerful theory, basically saying that, whatever is going to benefit the broader society is the course of action we should take. That individual rights can sometimes get in the way of our social responsibilities and lead to the dissolution of society and things like this. So before kind of, maybe leaving utilitarianism, I should probably point out that all societies are mostly utilitarian. Just by the nature of our biology, our sociobiology, among a number of other things, societies generally, will ultimately put, the freedom, or the group over the individual. At the end of the day, most societies will collectively choose to do that, choose to infringe upon rights if it brings about greater solidarity. And you can argue about whether or not that's, right or wrong, different situations, and so on and so forth. This was made popular by the Star Trek II. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, or the one, a famous line from Spock that's very much utilitarian, straight out of Bentham, basically. Now, libertarians see utilitarianism as basically inherently unjust. That essentially, libertarians argue that utilitarianism allows the society to disenfranchise the individual, to infringe upon their rights, to steal their property, take things from them, and so on, if the group feels that it's justified. And that may be unjust in terms of the rights of the individual and the individual's liberty. So libertarians, in the deeper philosophy, really focus on individual rights. I say in the deeper philosophy because there's a sort of libertarianism that's, in my view, somewhat shallow, and it doesn't get at some of these deeper philosophical questions that we'll be discussing. So libertarianism seeks to maximize autonomy, your freedom of choice, your freedom to associate with whoever you want to, your judgment over, a judgment imposed upon you by some governmental authority. And sometimes you see libertarians argue that, what we need is markets, not capitalism. And sometimes being critical of the current structures of capitalism, the corporate capitalism and so on. although there's a lot of disagreement and different ways in which you can conceive of libertarianism. So we'll just kind of go over some of the classic theories. Okay, one famous book that came out was written by a guy named Robert Nozick, famous libertarian philosopher. He wrote this book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia. And, it's a very, sounds like a catchy book. You need to read quite a few other philosophical works before you jump into this, just to let you know. Okay, so Nozick says there are basically two conditions that we see for libertarianism, and this comes out of Michael Sandel's kind of analysis of his work. Michael Sandel's a philosopher at Harvard. So Nozick says basically what we need is justice in acquisition, so initial holdings, basically. Did you, the things that you have, your property, the objects you own, and so on, did you receive those fairly? Were they received through the marketplace, basically? Not, you didn't steal them from someone. You didn't just go and beat someone up and take their stuff. So you need justice there. And then you need justice in transfer, the free market. So basically in terms of providing goods, taking your goods, giving them to someone else, basically he argues this has to happen through a market, that if you're doing it more through sort of a centrally controlled government or something like this, that this is sort of unjust because they're making determinations of where things should go, and it should be left to the market. Now, Nozick made this famous and rather controversial argument that goes beyond the standard argument in libertarianism about taxation. So taxation is viewed as unjust in libertarianism. So it's often, you might hear the phrase, taxation is theft. That's a very famous libertarian phrase. Well, Nozick actually went a step farther. He said that taxation of earnings from labor is on par with forced labor. Seizing the results of someone's labor is equivalent to seizing hours from him and directing him to carry on various activities. So he's basically saying there that taxation equals forced takings of earnings, taking of earnings equals forced labor, and forced labor equals slavery. Let me have a drink of tea before I get into this. So, taxation. So basically, you're having money taken out of your paycheck. If you work hourly, say for example, the last couple hours of your day, basically that money that you make there goes to the government in taxes, and you don't really have any say on that, at least in the actual technical taxation part. And so he says that this is basically forced labor. They're forcing you to work these last couple of hours. And what is forced labor? Well, forced labor is slavery. So that's a pretty radical argument. You can discuss, whether or not you agree with that. Something to discuss on the discussion board or in class next time. Very controversial argument. Most libertarians don't go that far, and I think Nozick himself may have backed off a little bit from some of his more extreme pronouncements. But usually you see libertarians agreeing up to the point of taxation is theft. Whether it's slavery or not, that tends to be a bit, forced labor and slavery. People have sort of dissected that a bit. So I think, which is one reason I don't think you see that argument made quite as often anymore. So libertarians acknowledge that there is going to be pretty substantial differences and pretty substantial inequalities. So we're seeing this right now, and we've been seeing this for quite some time. But with the pandemic happening, we're seeing some of these divides, these inequalities grow quite dramatically. And so we'll get into this much more specifically later on in the class. So what about inequality? Do libertarians just not care? Well, some don't. but many do. Many care about the poor, many care about social stability, things like this. Two very famous libertarians, David and Charles Koch. David Koch died, I believe it was David Koch, yes. David Koch died fairly recently, but these are two brothers. They are famous libertarians. Their argument is that, well, there are other ways in which you can help society other than government programs that come about through taxation. They say that charitable giving, donations, so they give a lot of money to these various institutions and causes and so on. Another famous libertarian was an Austrian thinker named Friedrich Hayek. He wrote this famous book called The Constitution of Liberty, where he kind of looks at the philosophy of liberalism, how it developed over time. Liberalism, and I'm using liberalism and libertarianism here sort of synonymously. So classical liberalism is basically what we would call libertarianism today, a little bit different than modern liberalism. Okay, so Hayek, he kind of develops this idea further, and he writes this famous book called The Road to Serfdom. He wrote this after the Second World War, and what he was worried about was the rise of either fascism or Soviet communism. The return, I should say, of those things in Europe. Communism was very much a real threat at that time, and they had just been through the horrors of World War II, and so they wanted to prevent Nazism and fascist movements from rising up again. Hayek was concerned that the growth of government, that the growth of any sort of government programs, whether it's government programs to help the poor, work on the environment, and so on and so forth, he worried that they would sort of just become more and more powerful to the point that they became like the Soviet Union, sort of an all-powerful governmental monopoly. So, interestingly, Hayek said that basically our freedom actually depends on economic freedom, especially property rights, more so than democracy. And this is where you see some divides within libertarianism. There are a lot of libertarians who don't believe in democracy, who say that democracy violates freedoms because sometimes the will of the majority can be to suppress individual rights. And they worry that regulation, redistribution, and so on can lead to serfdom. Serfs were the peasants of the feudal order of the medieval period. As I said, Hayek focused on markets. He said that governments are the sort of planned organizations, these planning agency, whereas markets come about as a result of this spontaneous order, that self-interest and profit motivates individual behavior, and so on. A lot of people have criticized that first one, basically, a spontaneous order. How is a market really any more spontaneous than the development of a government, which, isn't actually as, inert and solid as sometimes described? Governments are these constantly evolving organizations as well. How is that less spontaneous than the market? Again, things to consider. So Hayek basically argued that the role of government is basically to protect private property, to ensure that you have basic liberal freedoms, such as freedom of speech, association, the free press, and so on and so forth. Freedom of contracts, that you won't just sign contracts and have them be just neglected or broken, and so on and so forth. And democracy is okay unless it threatens property rights. Again, this is a more radical argument coming from the libertarians there. So these are the two kind of foundational books for libertarianism. A lot of stuff in this field that we'll kind of return to again, whether or not you are a libertarian or disagree strongly with it, whatever your view might be. It's something to explore. There's, like any sort of view, any sort of philosophy, kind of like utilitarianism too. If you just were to follow it to its letter, it ends up leading to some potentially bad things. We can kind of discuss that, or maybe not. Maybe you disagree. Okay, so what about the objections to libertarianism? Stay up here, I guess. Okay, one is that, well, okay, at least on taxation. Let's just focus on taxation here. What are the disagreements here? Well, one is that the poor might need the money more. Let's just take for an example right now. We have a huge economic stimulus package, unemployment benefits, and so on and so forth. Some people are calling for higher taxes on the wealthy, or, removing the low taxes on the wealthy that were enacted by the Trump administration as a way to pay for social programs. So that's one argument. There's another argument that says, taxation, if it's basically agreed to, if basically you have most people in society saying, we think that there should be higher taxes on the wealthy to pay for social programs, environmental programs, that sort of thing, that then, it's not necessarily coercion. That, you're basically having everyone in the society wanting to, believing that there should be more contribution coming from those who make more. And sometimes there's the argument that the successful owe a debt to society, that people like Jeff Bezos, for example, Amazon, they needed the infrastructure of the post office, the infrastructure of, the basically infrastructure of bridges and roads and so on and so forth. And I do find, when I've taught this class in the past, some interesting views here. So there are some big differences in terms of taxation for purposes of redistribution, so to help the poor, to pay for schools and things like that, versus money for infrastructure. There's a lot more, people are more willing for taxation to go to fix infrastructure rather than social redistribution. That's been my experience, at least. Okay. So, again, just, I spend a lot more time on libertarianism, I know. But, just kind of think about, would you consider yourself more utilitarian or libertarian? Maybe look into utilitarianism a little bit more before answering that if you want to. But you're not required. You don't need to know much more than is on this slide or in this lecture. Things to think about. Do you agree with the libertarian position on taxation? Should taxing the wealthy be used for public services, helping the poor, or research and development, infrastructure, military? Or, should it be used for some of those services and not others, or not at all? There shouldn't be any taxes on the wealth. What are your views on this? Okay, so moving from libertarianism to what you might call, I guess you would just call it kind of liberal moral philosophy, Rawlsian theory, developed by the philosopher John Rawls in this famous book from the early 1970s called A Theory of Justice. In fact, Nozick's book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, was actually written in response to A Theory of Justice. I'm doing this out of order chronologically. But Rawls, I think, just in terms of kind of explaining it, I think it helps to do it in this order. So Rawls basically said he wasn't a libertarian. He wasn't a strict sort of utilitarian where if you're a complete utilitarian, you're basically communist or sort of communistic in your approach. So Rawls basically says, well, you do need a free market economy, whether that's capitalist or socialist. And you can argue about whether you can have a free market socialism. That's something people do. Some people are working on. So he ruled out a command economy, the sort of old-style Soviet Union economy, or the economy that has existed throughout most of North Korea's history. So basically, that is a very oppressive system, and you want to get away from that sort of stuff. So just take a couple examples. You got Michael Phelps here. Holds the record for the most Olympic medals ever won. His net worth is about $55 million. So he's doing fairly well. So the question is, well, should he deserve $55 million? And is that different than, say, Michael Jordan? Michael Jordan, his net worth is $1.6 billion. Now, Michael Jordan, there are differences. Michael Jordan has played in sports that are much more lucrative, that are much more popular. He also has spent a lot of his money on foundations, so has spent a lot of it on programs for disadvantaged youth, for sports programs, and things like this. So the question is, okay, so can they be taxed at a higher rate to help people who are not doing as well? And that's, again, something you can think about. I'm not going to say what's right or wrong, because I don't know what's right or wrong. This is what this class is for. So Rawls but kind of think about that stuff. And think about, one thing to think about too is universities. Think about how much does the professor of Penn State football make? How much do Penn State professors make? How much does the hockey coach make? That sort of thing. And just kind of start thinking about how people are rewarded for what they do, because I think we may be entering a time where some of these things start to be revalued just based upon what's going on in the world. We'll see. Okay, so Rawls basically begins from the point of the moral arbitrariness of distribution, that we have our intrinsic nature, our biology, and that this is combined with the social conditions, the culture we grow up in, the country we grow up in, the language we learn first, that sort of thing, and that this equals no moral desert. And I don't actually mean desert like this, although it's pronounced like dessert and not desert. What that means is basically not deserving. So basically what he's arguing is that where we end up in life, our position in society, is not necessarily, we don't necessarily deserve it from a moral perspective. What does this mean? So we're not responsible for our choices, is that what he's saying? No, he's just trying to get us to think about this. So he gives us this hypothetical situation. So basically, we're thrown into the world. He wants us to imagine, this society that we could create on our own. If we could live in a society, what would our ideal society be? But then he adds a sort of a catch to this. No one would know their place in this society. So you would be thrown into it randomly. So you could be thrown into it and have a genetic disease that predisposes you to some really bad health problems. Or you could end up in some part of the world that doesn't have good health care or something like this. So how would we choose these principles of justice if we were to be thrown into the world randomly? And he says you develop in this thought experiment, you develop these principles of justice behind what he calls this veil of ignorance. So the veil of ignorance is this idea that no one would know their social position in advance. So he spends a lot of time discussing this, looking at the way in which people think and looking at, other philosophical perspectives and so on and so forth. And he says that, okay, starting not from necessarily people's ideal society, maybe, this sort of perfect moral society that they might envision. He says that rather people would actually choose their own self-interest, a society in which if they were thrown into it randomly, no matter what position or what conditions they would be under, they would have equal liberty. So if they ended up being a male or a female or black or white or, whatever, that basically they would have the same rights, no matter what no matter their identity or no matter where they were or whatever it might be. He also said there would have to be some sort of fairness in terms of equality of opportunity. That, you can't create actual egalitarianism, he argues. You can't create, people being actually equal, but you can develop a greater equality of opportunity so that, more people have, or, that everyone has the same, chances of going to college or, getting good health care and so on and so forth. Now, I like this phrase, this quote by him. Take a drink to read it. Rawls says, the natural distribution is neither just nor unjust, nor is it unjust that persons are born into society at some particular position. These are simply natural facts. What is just and unjust is the way that institutions deal with these facts. So we're born, I was born with not the best throat, which is kind of a problem for my chosen career. I'm supposed to actually be doing these voice therapy things, but with the coronavirus, those have been put on hold. So anyway, I hope you can hear me and my voice isn't too bad. But basically he's saying, we are born with these biological predispositions. And some of us, that's going to determine which way we go in life. And we have no control over that. And there's nothing that's just or unjust about that. That's nature. Now, how society, how our institutions, how they address this. Now, that's something that we have some control over. And, we can do that in a more just or unjust way. So he kind of wants us to think in terms of a game of chance versus game of skill. So if you win the state lottery, and this is Michael Sandel again, that Harvard philosopher, kind of uses Rawls to kind of make this point that you can if you win a lottery, you're entitled to all that money, that 500 million or whatever it is. But no one says you really deserve to win in the same way that, Michael Phelps deserves his gold medals, or Michael Jordan deserves all the awards he's won over his career. It's different, it's different. And so Rawls wants us to kind of think that life is sort of a mixture of both. It's not just a game of skill. And so he warns us he warns us from, kind of creating the ideals of our society based upon it being only a game of skill. There's way too much chance going on for it just to be, for our society to treat everyone based upon skill. That's his argument. So Rawls says, okay, so then is he just communist? What's going on here? Rawls is not. Again, as I said, he says that actually there probably has to be some inequalities and some hierarchies. You have to have people who teach other people to do things, and those people usually have greater authority. Me and you. So he says, okay, so what we can do here is justify inequality when those who are more privileged, wealthy, and so on and so forth, when they do things that benefit those who are the least well off in our society. So that can be everything from, paying more in taxes, or, donating huge amounts of money to charities, such as Bill Gates. Bill Gates is sort of on the front lines of the funding the coronavirus research battle, and so on and so forth. So Rawls says these inequalities, Bill Gates can be I believe he's now the second richest person on Earth. that's okay as long as, some of his money, a good proportion of it is helping those who aren't doing as well. That's Rawls's argument. He basically says that if we had this sort of system, this veil of justice, that you would see basically you would see these two principles of justice emerge from this thought experiment. Equal basic liberties for everyone. You would have libertarianism sort of utilitarianized or something. That basically, libertarianism would be part of this utilitarian framework that, our rights, our individual rights are collectively important. Recognizing that. And he would say that it would permit those who are more well off, who maybe started at a better position in society, and, became entrepreneurs. I wrote a book about entrepreneurs. Interestingly, entrepreneurs in American society tend to come from two groups. Immigrants, because immigrants come and maybe have trouble getting into the traditional labor market for various reasons. So they might start a business, a restaurant, a dry cleaner, things like that. So you have a lot of entrepreneurs come out of immigrant groups. The other sort of sector of society where you see a lot of entrepreneurs come from are already wealthy families. And this is because, when you're not an entrepreneur, basically you have to count on failing. A few of your businesses are going to go under before, you become the next, Jeff Bezos of Amazon or whatever it might be. The vast majority of entrepreneurs fail a few times. Most people can't afford to take that risk. And so that's why you see the vast majority of entrepreneurs, people who start businesses coming from families that are wealthy, so they usually already have sort of a financial cushion to fall back on if the business doesn't work out. So, what do you think about Rawls? And what do you think about this veil of ignorance? Do you agree with him that basically people would want this sort of institutional equality? Again, we're not talking about individual equality. We're talking about basically, everyone would have, the same level of services from hospitals and healthcare and education and so on. Now, one sort of final theory to get into is communitarianism. And just like the picture suggests, communitarianism kind of balances rights and responsibilities. Excuse me. So there's more liberal, left-leaning communitarianism, more conservative, right-leaning communitarianism, sort of middle-ground communitarianism. The basic idea here is that communitarians look at this debate between libertarianism and utilitarianism and says, well, clearly you've got to sort of join those together. So they're kind of Rawlsian, but kind of focus a little bit more to the utilitarian side, I would argue. There's a famous sociologist named Amitai Etzioni, who has done a lot of work, and most of his career has been dedicated to trying to understand community and trying to understand how we come to this idea of the common good. Over the last few years, he's been looking at things like the new normal, finding a balance between individual rights and the common good. This was after the terrorist attacks of September 11th. Now, this applies, I think, even more to the world of coronavirus and how do we balance, the common good and individual rights at these times. These are huge, huge questions now that will really determine a lot of things going forward. So I think it's very important for us to think about this. And I think Etzioni, what I like about him, other than he's a sociologist like me, is that he tries to explore and go down these various different avenues. And in recent years, he's been trying to think about ways in which to prevent China and the United States from going to war with each other. There are some people that think that, rising powers and falling powers just need a war. That's not necessarily always the case, but we do see it happen quite a few times in history. So Etzioni's been working on that. Communitarians, as I said, they're a little bit different in their focus. I'll go over here so you can read the text. So instead of thinking of governments and markets, which has been what's dominated a lot of the debate between utilitarians and libertarians, communitarians say we need to think about it in terms of individual and community. Markets, governments, at the end of the day, we're all individuals and we're all parts of communities, various communities. So the communitarian argument is that basically we need to strengthen our social order, figure out how to develop social bonds if they're fraying, coming apart, while at the same time, still protecting our individual freedoms, our individual rights, to the best that we can. So communitarians, what I also like about them is that they're not quite as abstract as some philosophers. They tend to basically say that whether we need more or less liberal rights or more, utilitarian legislation or policies and so on, it all depends on the context. It all depends on the moment. So they would say maybe that generally maybe we don't always want to monitor our citizens and people and so on, but maybe during a pandemic, maybe it's justified or maybe it's less justified. So communitarians basically will say that, okay, these abstract discussions are great. Okay, let's apply them. Let's go to the real world. How do these things work in the real world? Again, this is something that I like about them, just as someone who likes philosophy, but also likes praxis. Praxis stands for, or means practice. Putting theory into action, basically. Putting theory into action. Start losing my voice here. Okay, so, and they have this idea of the encumbered selves, that people are inevitably, biologically bound to community and society, that, there's no sort of real sort of individuals, off doing their own thing. You have, a few humans throughout history who do that, but we're a social organism. So we are connected and dependent upon our relations with other people. Okay, so communitarians, they start again from not the abstract, but from a few factual observations, that all forms of social order to extent draw on some sort of coercive means. Police, military, maybe not to the degree that some, to the degree of like a military dictatorship or a police state or something like that. But there's always some sort of, enforcement of the laws of the society, punishment for violating the laws, people that are going to protect you from some other society that tries to attack, that sort of thing. So communitarians start with that you're always going to have some sort of coercive means, some sort of infringement going on. Libertarians, hardline libertarians, will argue against that. They would say that basically, you need sort of certain utilitarian means, public spending or subsidies or something like this, if the market isn't providing. So here, communitarians are kind of like Rawls. But they argue that where the focus should be is on normative means. Normative means what the cultural norms of the society are, what the values are. So here, communitarians say, we really need to focus on values and morality more, really more discussion about what we think is right and wrong. Libertarian societies believe that markets should be used for utilitarian aims. So again, everybody at the end of the day is somewhat utilitarian because we're a social organism. At the same time, we also are increasingly libertarian in terms of our acknowledgement and our recognition of individual rights. Okay. Now, just kind of end this, I do want to just kind of point out that moral philosophy has been around for centuries. Moral psychology has not been around nearly as long. And we see in moral psychology that a lot of research has been done. I'll speak to this later, but what we see is that our intuitions, our sort of feelings come first, and then our rationality, our reasoning comes second. So this is something that interests me a lot, to a great extent. I'm actually doing a lot of writing in this area. Jonathan Haidt is a social psychologist. He wrote a book called The Righteous Mind. I would highly recommend looking at it. It's The Righteous Mind, and then the subtitle is Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. So it's a very good book for the moment. We'll be reading it in my social psychology class this fall. Another good book on moral psychology that looks at some of this is Moral Tribes by Joshua Green. Emotions, Reason, and the Gap Between Us and Them. Joshua Green is someone who went from philosophy to psychology and developed something called trolleyology. So basically what he does now is he gets people in MRIs, so he looks at their brains, does neuroimaging and stuff like that, and has them do the trolley experiments. And he has different renditions of it, and then he just kind of sees what's going on in their brains. And it's really fascinating stuff going on there. I highly recommend it. Both this book and the last book are really at the forefront of moral psychology, really helping us understand why we think in terms of us and them, and maybe how we can, if not change it, how we can sort of broaden our idea of who's us and who's them, or perhaps recognize that it's okay for there to be certain us and them divisions. Anyway, I think we have a lot of thinking, and I think we'll have a lot of discussions on this topic as we talk about things throughout the course. Okay, so there was this one experiment that I'll let you look at on your own. I'm not going to go into it in a lot of detail, but basically what they did was they had these students basically go into this room, and they were confronted with sort of an actual trolley experiment. They had two cages, and they were basically told that they could give a little electroshock to one of the mice. It was just the standard trolley experiment. You could redirect it, and it would send the current not to shock the 5 mice, but to shock the 1 mouse. They were supposed to be very painful, but non-lethal. Would you press the button? And a number of students said that they would. There was, some. If you look at the notes on this slide, which will be uploaded into the modules, what we see is that a lot of them, wanted to not shock the mice. So it kind of showed that, we tend to be pretty utilitarian, at least when it comes to this sort of scenario. When it comes to taxation and things like that, maybe not so much. But a lot of people will generally want to protect the many, even at the expense of the few. And this can lead to potential problems. As I said, we talked about in terms of, say, taxation, the wealthy and the poor, but it can also lead to sort of us-them dynamics that, we'll get into those. So the other aspect about the trolley experiment, I had a student one time say, I hate these trolley experiments. They're so abstract. You're never going to come across this situation in real life. Well, maybe not right away, but there's still trying to get self-driving cars going. It's not looking as good as it did a few years ago, so it may take a bit longer, but the technology is there. A lot of the technology is there. I mean, the technology has a lot of work to do, but the technology is advancing quite dramatically. Now, what's very interesting is the moral, the moral aspect. There's not a lot of advancement. In fact, there's not a lot of clarity in terms of what's going on. So I'll be opening up a module that will have the MIT, what they call a moral machine. This website where you get to actually choose, you get to take part in trolley experiments, basically because what they're trying to determine is what should these self-driving cars do in these different situations. You see, panel A, The car can choose to run through a group of people or turn, but it would kill one person. Or what does it do if it's, if there's just one person? Does it swerve out of the way, potentially driving off a bridge, killing you, but leaving one person alive? Or in the last panel, you've got a group of people. Does the car still turn and go off the road? And what if there isn't consistent regulation about it? Well, then you get different, companies having different, policies. The Ford Focus, 2030, this car is a libertarian model. It will run through the few to protect the one, I guess. Or this car is a utilitarian. You will save that group of people, but you might not make it out, and so on. So anyway, it's gone from being something that's just purely abstract to something that is actually much more practical and realistic. Okay, so that is it for today's lecture. I'll probably upload the one on population growth probably tomorrow. I think my voice is not as great right now, so I'll probably upload that one tomorrow. So again, this covers some of the stuff in Chapter 1. It also diverges, so just be aware of that. You don't have an assignment for Chapter 1, so just read Chapter 12 and watch the accompanying lecture. All right, have a good afternoon or evening or morning or whatever time it is, wherever you are.